Hello, so we're going to have a look at the essay title, Evaluate the Benefits of Regional Economic Integration for a Small Country Such as St. Lucia. So, obviously, the main topic that we need to be focused on within regard to this essay is economic integration. So, to start our essay off, we can look at defining a trade bloc. Because trade blocs are synonymous with economic integration. And when we think about trade blocs and economic integration, we're specifically focusing on removal of protectionist policies, and there may be other additional things that occur due to economic integration. That's very much dependent on the level of economic integration. So there may be free movement of labour, capital, there may be a common monetary policy and maybe a common currency that's used, and there may be certain restrictions on fiscal policy again. But again, that's very much dependent on the level and the depth of the economic integration. So that's a real key point that we're actually going to touch upon later in our answer. But obviously, be more specific to St. Lucia now. St. Lucia is a member of CARICOM, and that is a specific trade bloc within the Caribbean. So let's first of all start by looking at a particular benefit of economic integration. So what actually we maybe see now, due to the economic integration, there may be a larger market for export-based businesses. And the reason why we have a larger market for export-based businesses is because there is the removal of protectionist policies. So, for example, tariffs have been removed, and therefore, obviously, having a tariff removed is going to make certain products relatively cheaper. So the exports are now going to be relatively cheaper. So the goods or services that are exported will be relatively cheaper. And therefore, what we'd expect, because they're relatively cheaper, is we should expect to see an increase in volume and value of our exports. And as we know, therefore, that should increase aggregate demand, and that should lead to an increase in real GDP. Obviously, we can represent this on a diagram, and obviously we need to explain the diagram and what the diagram represents. So if we draw our axes, first of all, label those axes, price level, real GDP. We'll add in a long run aggregate supply curve, like so, a Keynesian one. We'll add in our first aggregate demand curve. We'll add in a second aggregate demand curve, we'll label that AD1. We'll put our price at P. We'll have Y, and we will have Y1. We'll just put an arrow to demonstrate the shift outwards of aggregate demand. So obviously the increase in exports has increased AD, and obviously specific to our diagram, increased AD from AD to AD1. What we see is we see an extension along the long run aggregate supply curve. And with that extension along the long run supply curve, we see that the increase in real GDP, which we mentioned before, and that's from Y to Y1. What that increase in real GDP represents from Y to Y1 is an increase in short-run economic growth. And the reason it's short-run is because it's an increase in aggregate demand. So the productive potential of the economy hasn't increased, but factors of production are being utilised more effectively. So we've got short-run economic growth. And we have a reduction in unemployment as well, which is represented from Y to Y1. And the reason for that is because labour, there's a derived demand for labour. So obviously if the economy is growing, export businesses are now exporting more, they obviously demand more labour in order to produce more products, which they can then export. So obviously we can quite clearly see there's significant benefits to be had from economic integration with regards to exports rising. And actually, when we're at the current level that we're operating at, if we're operating at AD, and we see an increase from AD to AD1, there is no change in the price level. So there's no change in the rate of inflation. No change in price level. It remains at P. So no change in the price level. So there's no change in inflation because what we see, the price level remains at P. Obviously, this point we can now evaluate it and criticise that actually the extent of these benefits aren't necessarily going to be seen. And the reason for that is it's very much dependent upon the amount of spare capacity. So the impact of this and the benefit depends on spare capacity. So, for example, if the economy was operating at full capacity, we can represent this on a diagram. So we'll put price level, we'll put real GDP down there, we'll draw our long-run aggregate supply curve, and we'll add in an aggregate demand curve that represents obviously the economy operating at full capacity. If we saw an outward shift of aggregate demand from AD to AD1, we'd see an increase in the price level. And we've got an increase in real GDP Y to Y1. So what we see here is with this increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD1 when at full capacity, we see a large increase in the price level, P to P1. And obviously that's represented a large increase in demand pull inflation. And what we see is we see a less than proportional increase in real GDP, obviously from Y to Y1. So obviously the benefits that are going to be seen due to economic integration if the St. Lucian economy was operating at full capacity isn't going to be as significant anymore, because obviously if we're operating at full capacity, we've got large amount of demand pull inflation now, and only a very marginal increase in real GDP. So we've got one point that's been well evaluated, and now we can move on to another point. So another benefit we may wish to consider with regards to this question is migration to St. Lucia. So depending on the level of economic integration, we could see free movement of labour. So the free movement of labour would obviously encourage people or workers in other Caribbean nations to come to St. Lucia. So as a result, we may see an increase in the quantity, and we may see an increase in quality if skilled workers from other Caribbean nations come to St. Lucia. We may see an increase in quality of labour as well. So what this means is that we're going to see an outward shift of our long-run aggregate supply curve, because obviously our factors of production have increased, in particular labour. And we can obviously represent this on a diagram. So price level is our y-axis, real GDP is our x-axis. We've drawn our original long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS. We draw a new one, LRAS1. Just draw an arrow to show the outward shift there, and we can add in an AD curve there. Price P1 Y1. So what we can see here is we can explain this outward shift. So the increase in quantity and quality of labour would cause an outward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve, increasing the productive potential of the St. Lucian economy. We see a And the increase in long-run aggregate supply is obviously from LRAS to LRAS1. As a result, we see an extension along the AD curve. That extension along the AD curve leads to an increase in real GDP, Y2, Y1, which is obviously representative of increase in long-run economic growth, because obviously the productive potential of the St. Lucian economy has increased. And obviously would see again a reduction in unemployment, because again there's a derived demand for labour. Obviously the economy is growing, and therefore there's going to be more demand for labour. And what we also see with that extension along the aggregate demand curve is we see a fall in the price level. So we actually see a reduction in cost push inflation. And obviously that was from P to P1. So actually we can see many benefits here of economic integration to the St. Lucian economy if the economic integration allows for the free movement of labour, because actually we would see an outward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. And obviously that brings many benefits with regards to increased economic growth, reduced unemployment, and also reduced cost push inflation. However, we need to be careful. Is it necessarily going to be beneficial for the St. Lucian economy? Not all the time. The key measure here that we need to consider is we need to consider net migration. If net migration is positive, what they would see is they would see benefits to the St. Lucian economy, because obviously got more migrants coming into more people coming into the St. Lucian economy than leaving. However, if the net migration is negative, actually what we're seeing is we're seeing more people are leaving St. Lucia. What we may see is we may see a brain drain. And what we mean by a brain drain is we may see high-skilled workers leaving St. Lucia and going to other Caribbean islands. So that loss of skilled workers is going to reduce the quantity and quality of labour. And that reduced quantity and quality of labour is actually going to cause an inward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So it's not necessarily going to be a good thing. And as I said, the key thing here we need to consider is net migration positive or negative? If it's positive, well then the St. Lucian economy will see the benefits of economic integration with the outward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. However, if net migration is negative, what we would see is we would actually see an inward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. And what that would mean, that inward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve, is obviously the opposite of what we've talked about. So there would actually be a decreased productive potential. And that decreased productive potential would lead to reduced long-run economic growth. What we'd actually see is we'd see rising unemployment. And we would see an increase in cost push inflation. Obviously, if we wanted to, we could represent that again on a diagram, but I haven't done so here due to space issues. But obviously, that was something we could have represented on a diagram. So we've quite clearly looked at two benefits and two issues that we may face with regards to economic integration, and say actually it may not necessarily be that beneficial. Now let's have a look at some other points we could have mentioned with regards to this essay. So another point we could have talked about, obviously being a benefit, we could have mentioned we may actually see the St. Lucian economy may see an increase in foreign direct investment. So why may we see that? Well, multinational corporations, MNCs, may wish to now set up in St. Lucia, or may wish to establish operations there. So they may build a factory, for example, where they're going to produce some of their goods in St. Lucia. But what that foreign direct investment would do is that would increase the long-run aggregate supply, and the reason for that is because there would be an increase in capital, not only quantity but also the quality of capital could be improved due to the foreign direct investment. And obviously we could represent this on a necessary diagram with regards to the increasing long-run aggregate supply curve. I'm not going to go through that because we already have done that on a previous point, but obviously it would do you no harm in drawing out the diagram. Again, just to reiterate why they may wish to establish their operations in St. Lucia due to the economic integration. Well, again, it's due to, obviously, removal of protectionist policies, for example. And what that would mean is the MNC could export to other nations in the region with no tariff, for example. So the reason why they would attract the foreign direct investment is because the MNCs established operations, and they established their operations because there's the removal of the protectionist policies, and as a result, that means the multinational corporation could export to other nations in the region with no tariff applied, and obviously that's why they'd want to set up in St. Lucia. Obviously, there are, again, potential issues here with regards to multinational corporations setting up in countries, especially developing countries like St. Lucia. So if we were to evaluate this point, obviously we could have environmental exploitation. So environmental exploitation by multinational corporations. What we mean by that, for example, is obviously if St. Lucia is very rich in certain natural resources, the multinational corporation may set up operations in that country, take advantage of all those natural resources and basically exploit them in a very short space of time, and meaning they're not available for future generations. And because those natural resources wouldn't be available for future generations, what that would mean is there'd be a reduction in the productive potential of the economy, and therefore we'd see an inward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So environmental exploitation by multinational corporation use up all natural resources, and using up all those natural resources would lead to a reduction in the long-run aggregate supply curve. And as we've mentioned before, obviously that would lead to reduced economic growth. Again, we may see rising unemployment. And we may see increased cost push inflation. So obviously we've looked at a point there about foreign direct investment may be attracted due to the economic integration. However, there are issues with regards to multinational corporations setting up in countries, because obviously they may exploit the natural resources. Just going back to the point on foreign direct investment, obviously we talked about long run supply increasing, and obviously we can talk about how that would increase economic growth, how that would reduce unemployment. We could also mention, obviously, foreign direct investment would actually have a positive effect on the balance of payments, particularly on the financial account. So we may see an improvement on the balance of payments financial account as well, due to those large streams of investment coming into the St. Lucian economy. So there's another benefit we've touched upon. Now, what I'm going to touch upon now is probably the most important benefit and drawback with regards to economic integration and whether it's positive or negative. So the beneficial aspect of economic integration would be trade creation. And what we mean by trade creation is we go from a high cost to a lower cost producer. And the reason why we do that is because of removal of protectionist policies, which we've already talked about. And obviously what we want to be doing here is we want to be including a necessary diagram. So we've got price, we've got quantity, we've got supply, we've got demand, we've got tariff, no tariff, we'll just put our equilibrium in, price, quantity, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and what we've got here, I'll just label these areas 1, 2, 3, and we'll label that area 4. Oh, P, I'll label that P1, I'll label that P2. We've got the tariff being applied to, we'll have that was world supply plus tariff, and then we'll have that as just supply from the trade block with no tariff. So we'll call that CARICOM. CARICOM no tariff, because obviously the trade block itself is not going to have any tariff on. So what we see here is when we are not in the trade block, so when we're outside of CARICOM, we may be receiving products from abroad, and what we want to do is want to protect our domestic economy through the use of tariffs. So obviously applying a tariff would help domestic firms within St. Lucia, obviously increasing the domestic production to quantity Q2. But obviously when we leave, that's at the detriment of the consumers within the St. Lucian economy, because they're only willing and able to buy a quantity Q3 when that tariff is applied, obviously making the goods more expensive. So obviously joining the CARICOM, what we see is we obviously see the removal of the tariff. We see a reduction in the price from P2 to P1. And what we see is a reduction in quantity supplied by the St. Lucian firms from Q2 to Q1. We see an increase in quantity demanded from Q3 to Q4. The number of imports, we see a rise in the number of imports. Originally that was Q3 minus Q2. Now it is Q4 minus Q1. So the number of imports rises. But the key things that we must think about are the impacts upon welfare. Well, unfortunately, producer surplus does fall by Area 1. We do see a loss of government revenue, by Area 3. But the key thing here is we see welfare gains of Areas 2 and 4. And the reason we see welfare gains of Areas 2 and 4 is because there's an increase in the consumer surplus by 1, 2, 3 and 4. So when the tariff was applied, there was welfare losses of Areas 2 and 4. Remove that tariff, we actually see welfare improve. And the reason for that is because obviously consumer surplus now rises due to the lower price from P2 to P1. So the key thing here is that economic integration can be beneficial to a nation due to improvements in welfare as areas shown by Areas 2 and 4. So economic integration is beneficial due to welfare gains. And that is the key thing that we must talk about here with regards to the benefits of economic integration. However, we must consider that economic integration isn't just going to lead to trade creation. It could actually lead to trade diversion. And trade diversion is when we go from a lower cost producer to higher cost producer. And again, we're going to draw the necessary diagram with regards to trade diversion. So we've got price, we've got quantity, we've got our upward sloping supply curve, we've got our downward sloping demand curve. We'll put on our market equilibrium of price and quantity there. We will have a look at this particular example. So we may argue that, for example, let's say the Bahamas, for example. Bahamas are the lowest, not the Bahamas. We'll put that as the USA, for example. We'll put that as the USA. We may say the USA is the lowest cost producer. We may say that the Bahamas is also a producer. And what we'd have here is we'd have USA plus tariff. And we'll put our quantities in there. So if we have that as Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and we'll label that area A, B, C, that area is D, and that area E, and we'll label that P1, P2, P3. So what we have here is the USA of a particular good is the lowest cost producer of that particular good. And what we do in St. Lucie before we join CARICOM is we purchase the products from the USA with the tariff applied to them because the USA are the lowest cost producer, but we protect our domestic industry, so we apply a tariff to those US-based products in order to protect, as I mentioned moments ago, to protect the St. Lucian domestic businesses. Bahamas, they are also a producer of this specific good, but if we were to purchase the products from them with a tariff applied to them before we obviously join the CARICOM, obviously that would be more expensive than the USA plus the tariff, and therefore obviously we don't buy from the Bahamas originally, because Bahamas plus tariff would have obviously been higher than USA plus tariff. So we purchase things from the USA with the tariff applied to it. Obviously now we join CARICOM. So we join CARICOM. And by joining CARICOM, obviously there's no tariff on Bahamas, but there's still a tariff on the USA. So there's still a tariff on the USA-based products, but there's no tariff on the products from the Bahamas. So obviously products from Bahamas are now relatively cheaper. So the price falls from P3 to P2. And what we therefore see is we see these specific impacts. So decreased quantity supplied from Q2 to Q1. We see an increase in quantity demanded from Q3 to Q4. We see a increase in the number of imports from Q3 minus Q2 to Q4 minus Q1. What we see is we see a reduction in producer surplus by area A. We see a increase in consumer surplus by A, B, C, D. Obviously, that's due to the lower price. We see welfare gains of areas B and D. Again, because they've been transferred to the consumer surplus. But what we do see is we see loss of tax revenue from the tariff from areas C and E. And the issue here is actually we have a welfare loss if area E is larger than areas B and D. So, we need to make sure we reiterate it's a welfare loss. Welfare loss if area E is larger than areas B and D, because obviously we're not receiving the tax revenue from the tariff anymore because we're buying our products from Bahamas, and obviously they're in CARICOM, so they don't have to get any pay for those pay the tariff. We don't have to put a tariff. There is no tariff because the economic integration has removed the tariff, and therefore we lose out on the tax revenue. We obviously do get welfare gains due to obviously removing the tariff, but obviously that tax revenue is lost and is not converted to anything else. Obviously, all A, B, C, and D obviously go to consumer surplus due to the lower price, but that area E is completely lost. So if area E is larger than B and D, what we are going to see, unfortunately, is a welfare loss to society. And obviously that is a significant drawback of economic integration, so we must bear that in mind. So trade creation being a benefit, we must talk about, and obviously talk about the welfare gains that will occur. And obviously with regards to trade diversion, that's a clear drawback of economic integration due to the welfare loss that can occur due to it. So we've looked at loads of different points there. In particular, we've looked at actually 4 benefits with regards to economic integration, and we've looked at again 4 potential issues that we may face with regards to economic integration. So just some other final points that we may wish to consider with regards to this essay, with regards to particular drawbacks. You may see there's a loss of monetary policy, for example. So obviously if monetary policy is controlled by a common central bank that's applied, so there's a loss of monetary policy, therefore you may not be able to control inflation. So you may not be able to control inflation because you can't set interest rates appropriately. So actually what it may lead to is large levels of inflation, potentially, which could also be very damaging for the economy. There is potential, obviously, issues with loss of fiscal policy as well. That may be due to certain rules with regard to the amount of government debt that can be obtained, so therefore may not be able to stimulate economy. Because obviously there's going to be no increases in G and therefore no increases in aggregate demand. So you couldn't use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy because there may be some specific rules that you may have to follow. So again, these are all potential drawbacks associated with economic integration. The only real benefit that we may have with regards to obviously loss of monetary policy, having a common monetary policy, is obviously if there's a common currency. And obviously if there's a common currency, obviously exports, there can't be any competitive gains based on the exchange rate. So countries can't gain an advantage via the exchange rate because the exchange rate is, well, the currency is the same in each country, so you can't gain through the exchange rate. You couldn't devalue the currency because the currency is the same in each nation. So ultimately, your exports may be in greater demand because actually you produce better quality exports than the other countries. Better quality or cheapest exports, better quality, not exports necessarily, goods, or the best quality or the cheapest goods would see an increase in X, which would obviously increase aggregate demand. So there are benefits. Obviously, countries can't gain advantages through using the exchange rate. So if St. Lucia has the best quality exports or the lowest cost producer, when we talk about being cheapest, it's the lowest cost producer. They may therefore see improvements in their exports and increase in aggregate demand. So again, that's a benefit of that. So we've looked at lots of benefits, lots of drawbacks, and now we're just going to come to our judgment with regards to whether it is beneficial or not. So economic integration. Is it good or is it bad? And just explain why. And that should only be a couple of sentences wrapping up really what we've discussed in our essay. And then you may say it depends on. And a really good point to consider that we mentioned right at the very beginning of this video is it depends on the level of economic integration. Because depending on the level of economic integration will determine the amount of benefits that could be obtained, or even the amount of drawbacks that could be obtained as well through this economic integration. So, for example, if it was a free trade area, for example, we would only be looking at the benefits of free trade. Whereas, on the other hand, if we were looking at a customs union or a common market, or even moving on to an economic union, for example, we would be seeing lots more benefits. A free trade area, you're only going to see benefits of free trade. Whereas if we're obviously thinking about an economic union, we're typically going to be seeing free trade, free movement of labour, you'd also see free movement of capital, you'd have common currencies, for example, So very much dependent on the benefits, and the drawbacks is very much dependent upon the level of economic integration. If it's only a free trade area, well, then you're only really going to see the benefits from increased exports, and you obviously the benefits of trade creation, and you wouldn't see the benefits of migration, for example, which obviously could be obtained as well. But obviously, if it's an economic union, we'd obviously get the benefits of obviously having a common currency, and therefore gains in the exchange rate can't be obtained, which may be beneficial for a certain country who's who's the best producer or the lowest cost producer of a certain good. Right, so that is that. That's a lot of detail to have a look at, and lots of points we could have actually mentioned in this essay. But the key thing here is we're looking at quality of points, and the main thing I wanted to point out was obviously making sure we explain trade creation and trade diversion in detail, linking obviously trade creation to welfare gains and trade diversion to welfare losses with regards to economic integration. Because when we talk about economic integration, we want to be talking about trade creation and trade diversion. Those are the big two things that we must include in our responses in order to make sure we demonstrate to people that we understand what we mean by economic integration. So just to recap, evaluate the benefits of regional economic integration for a small country such as St. Lucia. We could talk about exports, it being improved. We could talk about obviously migration, but we did say we may lose some key workers, for example, and we did say that obviously exports could lead to demand pull inflation. We talked about multinational corporations may be interested in investing in these countries now due to the benefits of obviously the free trade, for example, but however those multinational corporations could exploit countries. Then we moved on to the big, really important parts with regards to trade creation and trade diversion, and said obviously the welfare gains that can be had with trade creation and the welfare losses that can be had with trade diversion. We considered some of the impacts of monetary policy and fiscal policy and how that could impact. And then finally, we said in our judgment, actually, the level of economic integration is going to be really important, because actually there are more benefits that can be obtained through an economic union, for example, than can be obtained through a free trade area. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please do let me know.